morning, everyone, and welcome to the hashtag Webinar Wednesdays of the UP SLIS. Today's webinar is special because we have an international speaker with us. This webinar is in line with the theme of the Gabriel A. Bernardo Memorial Lecture, which is Envisioning Critical Librarianship for the Philippines. This event is organized by the UP School of Library and Information Studies in celebration of its 59th anniversary and the 30th Library and Information Services Month. Thank you very much for tuning in. I am Paul Jason Perez, faculty member of the school, and I will be your moderator for today. To formally welcome us to this event, let's hear from the Dean of the UP School of Library and Information Studies, Professor Mary Grace Golfo Barcelona.
Thank you, Sir PJ, and good morning and thanks to all who are watching from home here in the Philippines, and a pleasant evening or day, whichever is applicable to all our viewers from all over the world. November was designated as the Library and Information Services Month in 1991 by virtue of Proclamation number 837 series of 1991. It was signed by then President Corazon C. Aquino. The said proclamation calls upon all residents, regardless of race or creed, and the public and the private sectors, to extend their full support to the observance of Library and Information Services Month. The purpose of the LIS Month celebration is to highlight the effort and invaluable service that libraries and information centers render to the public. Among these include providing data and materials for lifelong knowledge and learning, and for research and leisure. And this year is the 30th year of the LIS Month celebration. For several years since its approval, the UP-SLIS has been participating in different activities geared towards the celebration of the LIS Month. In the past, our students have joined the LIS Wizards sponsored by Paddles. Our faculty members have been invited to speak in fora and conferences in relation to the LIS Month celebration. The biggest book fair in the country was held in the past years during the LIS Month. Likewise, the PLY Annual Congress is usually held in November, also in conjunction with the celebration of the LIS Month. This year's celebration is particularly special and unique, not only because it is the 30th year, but because of the current pandemic that we are experiencing. We add to this the recent devastation of two very strong typhoons that ravaged a big part of the country. What made it special? Because despite all these challenges, we have proved that we, the members of the LIS profession and our dear LIS students, have remained formidable in these tough times. We experienced scathing, forced to change our lifestyles, and thought of different ways to deliver our tasks effectively despite. I am proud to say that the UP-SLIS has continuously been fighting and adapting. We persevere, and we will continue to do so. Proof to this are the regular online activities that UP-SLIS has been delivering to reach out to our stakeholders. We have started our SLIS Road to 60 activities as part of the 59th anniversary and in preparation for the 60th anniversary next year. We have launched our I Remember project, and later after the talk, we will hold a soft launch of the SLIS Coffee Table book, which is a fruit of 10 long years of labor and love of the editorial team. All the proceeds of the Coffee Table book will go to the UP-SLIS Building Fund. Hence, today's webinar is not just one of the lined-up events, but a special effort to continue and to keep the tradition that has started 30 years ago. We are celebrating the LIS month despite. And may I say, the webinar theme today, which was originally the theme of the Gabriel A. Bernardo lecture series that was postponed due to the nationwide lockdown in March, critical librarianship in a global context, aptly exemplifies the LIS profession's boldness and perseverance. This is coupled by our equally bold and inspiring resource speaker, Emily Drabinski. All right, I will no longer keep you waiting. Welcome to UPSLIS webinar, Classifying Difference, Critical Librarianship in a Global Context. Again, thank you very much for joining us today, and let us all listen and learn.
Thank you very much, Dean Mary Grace. November is indeed a busy month for everyone in LIS. We welcome all viewers of this webinar, from practicing librarians, information professionals, teachers, and students of LIS, and all those interested in information studies from around the world. This webinar is live streamed on Facebook and YouTube pages of the UP SLIS. I know you're all excited to hear from our invited speaker, but first, here are the mechanics for our webinar. If you have any questions during the lecture, you can go to menti.com and type in the code 438916. Click Ask a Question, and then you will have a space where you can type in your questions. It will be posted anonymously, so we highly appreciate if you include your name and affiliation in your question. You can also view previously posted questions, so kindly check them to avoid redundancies. We will not be entertaining questions posted on the comment section of this video. So for your questions, again, please go to menti.com and type in the code 438916. We will be going through your questions after the lecture. For the certificates, we will be issuing certificates of participation to those who will be attending the webinar. We ask that you finish the event and watch out for the announcement containing the link to where you can register for your certificates. For registered professionals, this webinar may be applied for continuing professional development, or CPD, a self-directed learning activity. Please stay with us until the end of the event so that you can have the link to register for your certificates. If you find this morning's topic interesting, we also invite you to like and share this video so that the world would know more about it. Just click share on the lower right side of your screen. Please also like our Facebook page, UPSLIS, where this video is currently being streamed, and also on YouTube. That's UPSLIS on Facebook and on YouTube. You may also find UPSLIS on Twitter, and also again on YouTube, where the recording of this webinar will be posted. Okay. So for those who just tuned in, we welcome you to this special episode of the 2020 UP SLIS webinar series entitled Classifying Difference, Critical Librarianship in a Global Context. This is connected with the theme of the 2020 Gabriel A. Bernardo Lecture, with the theme of Envisioning Critical Librarianship for the Philippines. This organized in celebration of the 59th anniversary of the UPSLIS and the 30th Library and Information Services Month. Now, I am delighted and honored to introduce our speaker for this morning. Our speaker is all the way from New York City. She's an associate professor and critical pedagogy librarian at the Mina Reese Library of the City University of New York, or CUNY. Aside from being a practicing librarian, she's also a liaison to a number of graduate programs at CUNY. With her background in political science, librarianship, and rhetoric, her research interests include critical approaches to information literacy instruction, gender and sexuality in librarianship, and intersections of power and library systems and structures. She was with us at the UPSLIS as a visiting professor, and truly we're very happy to have her with us for this lecture. Let us welcome Professor Emily Drabinski.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here I'm going to set a timer because I have a tendency to go either too long or too short. So I'm going to set a timer for myself. I'm pleased to be joining you on video. I really wish that I was joining you in Quezon City instead. I miss the food and the company and the laughter and the stray cats and the humidity and the jeepneys and the SM Super Mall and all of it, and just am so sorry that I can't be delivering this lecture to you all at Gonzalez Hall or elsewhere on campus. I was planning to give this talk back in March when I was at UP Diliman as a visitor, but the pandemic hit, and here we are many, many months later, and I'm sending you a Zoom recording over a set of PowerPoint slides, which probably is going to be less fun than it would be if we were laughing together, but I'm pleased for the opportunity to share some thoughts. And I'm very grateful to the School of Library and Information Studies for inviting me to share my thoughts on classifying difference, critical librarianship in global context. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour, I think, and hopefully the technology will enable us to have a live Q&A after the screening of the talk. If not, I have every intention of returning to UP as soon as pandemic conditions lift, and I'll look forward to continuing the conversation with you when we are able to be together again. So, critical librarianship. Well, let me start back here. Critical librarianship is something I've spent a lot of my career studying and writing about and talking about with groups of librarians and library school students and library faculty. In 2010, I was co-editor of a book called Critical Library Instruction Theories and Methods with American colleagues Maria Accardi and Alana Kumbier. And we were interested in the ways that critical pedagogy, meaning how do we teach in a classroom in ways that interrupt dominant voices in the classroom and enable learning to happen from below and collectively and in community, how can we produce that in an information literacy session where I'm teaching you ostensibly how to use the library? So that collection came out 10 years ago. And since that time, I've done a lot of thinking about what critical librarianship can do in ways that advance justice work in libraries and around the world. My first trip to the Philippines was back in 2018, I think, or 2017. My partner is working on a book about Mindanao, and so was at UP Diliman doing some work, and I came to visit with her and went over to the UPD main library and took a look around just to see, you go, if you're a librarian, you go anywhere and you go on a tour of the library. And I was lucky to get a tour from Professor Elijah, who showed me lots and lots of parts of the library that I hadn't seen before. And what struck me was that even though I was 16 hours across the globe by plane, more than that. I was like, Philippines is very, very far away from Brooklyn, New York, which is where I live. I was struck by how similar the library was at Diliman as the library at my home campus at the time I worked at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York. How, I thought to myself, could I travel so far across the world and still the questions of dealing with fake news and trying to understand how to get students to sort of do research in ways that use reliable sources and understand the difference between scholarly information and non-scholarly, and all of the sort of programming at the library had a lot in common with what I did at home. Lots of other things too, including the classification system. And so as someone who's written a lot about critical classification in particular, I was struck by how narrow the view can be if we don't step outside, we meaning people in the United States like myself, if people in the US don't step outside of their sort of US-centric viewpoint, the sort of US blinkers that we sometimes have on, to see the ways that global context shape the conversations that we have in American libraries. And so this talk is sort of the beginning of what I'm hoping will be a long, long written project, sort of looking at the ways that US global power has shaped librarianship around the globe and the ways that it has the U.S. has been similarly impacted by library work happening in other contexts. And I have to say, as someone who lives in the U.S. in the sort of seat and site of a lot of sort of neo-imperial violence that is enacted in all kinds of ways that are maybe not, where maybe we don't think of the library as automatically one of those spaces where U.S. imperial violence and control manifests. I think it is in some ways that are pretty interesting to think and talk about, and that make those of us who are librarians put us, I think, in a pretty good spot for intervening in conversations about sort of U.S. global power in other contexts. So that's, I guess, the broader claim of the project. And now I'd like to start by sort of talking through a little bit about what librarianship is. So in this talk, I want to sort of share my thoughts on what critical librarianship is, but I think that we have to begin with an understanding of what librarianship is. So just to go through, like, this is Libraries 101 from when I was in library school. If I was there, I'd ask you all to tell me what you think librarianship is, but since we're not together, here's what I think it is. First, libraries select and acquire materials. That's what we are at the very root, right? Is we are a collection of things, and it's the librarian's job to choose from among the sort of many offerings for materials, and then to acquire those materials. So I select, and then I purchase and bring things into my collection. The second thing I do, once it comes in, I need to describe it and classify it. So resource description and classification is at the heart of what libraries do. That is what makes materials discoverable by our patrons. It is the thing about which we have the most expertise compared to other people at the university or in a city or a school. The cataloging and classification function of librarians is sort of a key thing that we do in our work. So we select and acquire, we describe, and then we circulate things, right? We enable access to the collections, and we enable items to move around, right? So essentially a library, we bring things together in common and we share them around, things circulate. And I've been thinking a lot about this function over the last many months, right? Where the act of circulation, the act of moving from one place to another physically has become quite fraught, very dangerous thing to do. And so that is something that we do, right? All we do is move things around and circulate them. And libraries that, we often imagine them or nostalgic for them as safe places where everyone belongs, have become places that are sort of vectors of disease, where we can't let anything circulate because of how dangerous circulation has become in a pandemic. And then next is reference and instruction, the sort of connection piece, where I, as a librarian, assist the patron in making use of the resources in the library collection and outside the library collection to answer questions and satisfy lines of inquiry, right? So that's, I think, the role I've always seen as most important, since that was what I did for a living until very recently when I became the interim chief of the library. I've spent most of my career at the reference desk and in a classroom helping students. I've been an academic librarian for most of my career, helping students sort of clarify their questions and then engage in the systems that we set up for information retrieval and helping people one-on-one or in groups answer their questions. So that's a key piece of librarianship. And then there's the preservation piece, right? So after I've selected and acquired, I make decisions, critical decisions about what is worth saving and what I can give away. It's that preservation piece. And then I think this is sort of, we talk about this more in contemporary libraries than we did when I started my career, the role that librarians play in knowledge production. So not just in terms of giving you the book you need to do the research, to add the citation to the book that you're writing, but instead working as sometimes publishers ourselves, as open access publishers of journals, as library presses. At least in the US, you see a lot of collaboration between university presses and the library as knowledge production gets increasingly housed inside of our library. So this is how sort of the picture of librarianship that I remember from my Libraries 101 class in library school. And I'd be interested if we were all together in hearing from you all if anything has gotten left out here, or if there are ways that librarianship works in the Philippines that I'm sort of missing from this list. So if that's librarianship, what is a critical librarianship? And before I jump to that, I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure, because I think that is sort of all of these pieces that I've outlined in the slides require an infrastructure sitting underneath the reality that we occupy that sort of produces that for us. So I want to talk a little bit about what those infrastructures are. So when I say infrastructure, I mean think of things like the internet wires and cables that have to go underneath the ocean that enable me to record this video on my computer in my office in Manhattan, New York, United States of America, and get it all the way to the UP Diliman to Quezon City, where it will be uploaded to something, some technology that I'm sure I wouldn't understand, and then broadcast to all of you who are watching this video. I'm not that interested in the wires, right? I'm more interested in what Emily is going to say, except that what I'm going to say relies entirely on the existence of those wires under the water, right? So infrastructures create the sort of reality that we occupy. I keep going like this with my hands because I think about it as like maybe like a pop-up book, right? When you open it and things come out of it, but like you need that sort of what sits underneath it to give rise to the library. So I think if I talk about a few of them, it'll make that idea a little more concrete. So first, the first infrastructure, and the one I'm going to spend the most time talking about, is cataloging and classification schemes. So these are the Library of Congress classification that puts books, tells the librarian where to put a book on a shelf and next to what books, and also the cataloging language that allows us to describe those materials, right? So those are library infrastructures that we can't have a library without, right? Resource sharing and interlibrary loan. So in my library, we use something called Iliad. That's a piece of software that enables sharing materials between libraries. So all of those are infrastructures, right? So somebody puts an interlibrary loan request in. There's a whole lot of back-end hidden work that's done that gets the book to them, and that those structures are those sort of systems are part of a library infrastructure for resource sharing. Think about circulation systems and platforms. We just in my library made the switch to Alma, which is an ex libris product that we now spend a lot of money and staff time trying to understand so that we can share our materials with our patrons. I think of email and shared calendars as kinds of infrastructures in the library. How do we communicate with one another? Is it email? Is it phones? The communication that we have with each other is absolutely essential to any kind of smooth functioning of a library. And then time itself as a kind of infrastructure. When are we going to meet with each other? Who's going to be at the reference desk when? Who is in charge of the circulation desk when? Right? Those systems that we use to tell each other what we're doing and where we're going to be are a kind of library infrastructure. How about this one? Heating, ventilation, and cooling. Every library is too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet. There's always something wrong with it, right? The HVAC system as a kind of infrastructure. So is it when I first visited the Dillamon Library, there was a leak in the archives, and the collection had a big plastic tarp over it to keep it safe from the leak. And I was struck when I visited that same leak, we had it at my library at the time. I had been on a job interview at a library at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Same thing. They took me on a walk through the library at this big leak, with a plastic tarp over it. So that is also a sort of an HVAC problem that I think of as a kind of library infrastructure. It means that part of the collection is inaccessible, right? Physical space and its arrangement, who can walk where and when. And we'll talk more about this a bit later, but one of the things I think is interesting about the physical arrangement of a library space is that it reflects that cataloging and classification infrastructure, right? So that scheme that orders books in a certain way also orders the physical space of a library in a certain way, by putting the books about US foreign policy in the E's and the books about psychological disorders in the R's, and sort of keeping parts of the library collection separate. That's not just in the intellectual structure of the classification scheme, but also in the physical arrangement and physical map of the library. What else, right? If I was there, I would love to keep brainstorming about what these library infrastructures are, because I think that there are lots and lots of them. If I go, let me go back to this. Let me go all the way back to this slide. So all of these things that we do in libraries rely on the existence of an infrastructure, right, that we use to carry out these tasks. And so the claim that I want to make in my talk today is that any kind of critical librarianship that intervenes in one of these infrastructures has the most potential to change what our reality looks like, right? So if I decided that the most important thing in my library, the critical intervention I was going to make, is that the physical space needed to be accessible to everyone, regardless of, say, physical disabilities. That's a critical intervention I could make into how the space is arranged, that would make a sort of contribution to justice and equity that's pretty significant. Because I think anytime I'm changing a system, I'm changing an infrastructure, the thing that produces the reality, that has the most potential to change what the reality actually looks and feels like, right? And so a critical librarianship focuses its work, I think, most effectively on intervening in these infrastructures that enable the work of librarianship that are sort of outlined on the previous slide. So now I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about a particular kind of infrastructure that I think is sort of most interesting to think about as a space for intervention and potential change. And when I think about what kind of critical librarianship work could be done through a sort of cross-cultural engagement or a cross-national engagement between those of us in the US and librarians across the world. What I think is exciting is thinking about how to disrupt and intervene in critical ways our cataloging and classification, into our cataloging and classification structures. So I want to take a minute to talk about that infrastructure as a site for potential change. And before I do that, why do we classify and catalog things? Now, if I was there, I would wait and make somebody raise their hand and tell me what you think. But here's why I think we classify and catalog things, because without that, our libraries would be like this slide picture, right? Just a big old pile of books. Found this image by Googling big old pile of books, and this is what I came up with. So we classify and catalog things so that people can retrieve items in a meaningful way from the collections that we have selected and acquired, right? So if we don't have a classification or cataloging scheme in our library, every time you come in, you have to sort of paw through a big stack of books, big pile of books, trying to find what you want. So one of the key interventions that American librarianship has made for the world is in coming up with schemes that developing the first scheme. I think Melville Dewey's decimal system in the late 19th century turned numbers, the sort of call numbers, from just like a sort of random number to instead fitting those numbers inside of systems and structures. Does that make sense? I feel like I got a little lost in my language. So let me try that again. So we're going to do two things when we classify and catalog. One, we're going to take the book and decide what it's about. That's the act of classification. And we're going to put it on a shelf next to other books that are about the same thing. So if I go to the shelf looking for a book about nuclear power, right? And I have a title, I can look around that book and serendipitously find many, many books on the same topic. So we classify things, we sort like with like, put them on a shelf together. Then we catalog things, that's the descriptive language assigning the assignment of controlled vocabulary terms to particular books so that, or particular items in a collection, so that I can search on those terms and retrieve everything on a given topic. Think of sort of something that has a lot of synonyms, right? Like night, evening, after hours, twilight. I'm thinking about that because it's getting dark out my window, right? I don't want to have to search for each of those terms, so I pick one, resolve it on that single term, right? So we control the vocabulary to make it easier to retrieve everything on a given topic in our collections. So that's the reason that we're cataloging and classifying. And that is the act of building an infrastructure, right? Because then once I've cataloged and classified, I'm going to put the books on the shelf according to that arrangement. And now I've got a set of stacks that a user can sort of walk the classification as they walk the library stacks looking for the materials that they need for their work. So a critical intervention into that infrastructure recognizes the power that cataloging and classification systems have to determine how we describe things, the language that we use, and whose viewpoint is represented in the classification scheme. So this is a picture of the cover of Sandy Berman's book, Prejudices and Antipathies. Sandy is an American librarian who found himself working outside of the United States in, escaping my mind where he was. He's in an African country and he's cataloging and he's using language that in the United States is simply descriptive, but in the cultural context is actually quite offensive. And this moment of cataloging as a United States cataloger in a foreign country and seeing the sort of ways that the language is language that is flat and appropriate and just fine to use in the United States context is radically racist elsewhere. This gave him this insight that in the 1970s, in this book, Prejudices and Antipathies, he writes about Library of Congress subject headings and the ways that they are extremely biased and they represent only a particular point of view, and in fact, sort of produce a narrative and a story about the world that reflects only one way of seeing things, right? That classifies materials according to a dominant ideology, a dominant set of ideas about how the world works and what it is. So I think this is a good quote from that book where he is writing about the ways that LC headings reflect parochial, jingoistic Europeans and North Americans, white-hued, Christian, Protestant, middle, higher income classes, loyal to this established order, imbued with the transcendent, incomparable glory of Western civilization. So his argument here is that classification and cataloging is inherently biased, that it inherently reflects the position and view of the world of the dominant classes, and that this is this insight sparked a critical classification movement in the United States, and is at the heart of what I think matters when we're talking about critical librarianship. For me, it's the first intervention into an infrastructure and an acknowledgement that the structures that sit underneath the libraries that we live and work in and use are hidden systems that order knowledge in ways that exclude the vast majority of us in order to tell the stories of a tiny elite few. So this, I think, is an interesting thing to keep in mind when I'm looking at classification and cataloging systems and how they order collections in libraries that are not in the United States. So I want to take just a quick tour over here to the subject headings and classification order for the annexation of the Philippines in 1898. And so if you look at this, this is the story of the US colonization of the Philippines is told in the E section, right? So this is the E section, this is the history of the Americas. So what's interesting about the Philippines from the point of view of the Library of Congress classification system is its annexation by the United States, right? So we can see that the way that this particular portion of the Library of Congress classification reflects a distinctly American, distinctly imperial view of the Philippines. I'm also interested in the very flat language of it, right? So the annexation of the Philippines in 1898 and then the War of 1898 are extremely violent events, right? The imperialism of the United States, the sort of colonial takeover from the Spanish is an extremely bloody sort of takeover. It involves a lot of colonial violence. I mean, colonization is a violent act, right? So it's reduced in the classification both to the U.S. position that this is an act by the McKinley administration, right? You don't see a whole lot of agency on the part of Filipinos in the classification. In fact, their experience isn't captured here at all, right? And annexation is a sort of bloodless term used to indicate a sort of major imposition of US power on the people of the Philippines. And here we see that it gets sort of erased here, right? And so I think this gets lost in a lot of American conversations about critical librarianship where we don't see outside of the borders of the United States. And we don't see that the classification itself, even if we were to internally critique it at great length, it isn't, in the US, we often have a very parochial critique. We are concerned about representation of United States citizens without a whole lot of a sense of the rest of the world. So does this matter, right? Couldn't I have a local classification or cataloging scheme that just captured sort of the ways that people in my community see the world? And that's actually a big part of the push of a lot of people in the critical cataloging movement. Is like a move towards contextualized and local classification and cataloging schemes that order materials specifically for the community. What's different about the US is that it's not just any country, and in fact, the US exports its knowledge organization systems all around the globe, and it sort of we see that play out in particularly violent ways in the Philippines as the first US colonial holding, right? So I think we can, if we think about library classification cataloging, we think about that infrastructure as sort of a piece with other sort of elements of an information state. We can see the ways that librarianship contributes to the production of US state power that is then exercised at the grave expense of people in the Philippines and other parts of the world where the US wields its power on behalf of sort of bloody and violent colonial regimes. Alfred McCoy makes this point in his work, Policing America's Empire, where he looks at how the sort of concurrent with the annexation of the Philippines in 1898 is an information revolution that includes the production of Melville Dewey's classification system, the Cutter numbers that come at the Library of Congress, and then the production of the Library of Congress classification scheme, which is what's used at UP Diliman to organize the collections. McCoy sort of parallels that those sort of library infrastructures of data with other kinds of ways that the US is mobilizing information, sort of surveillance and data on behalf of its extension of state power and control and surveillance. And so he writes that the US, sort of the innovation that comes concurrent with the annexation of the Philippines is instead of data just being sort of a list that was used, that the state now is able to take the sort of lists and data and begin to exert control. So he's writing about other kinds of data surveillance, like if I can count the number of people and then enact a sort of political power regime on those people. Librarianship is not the same, right? We are not sort of going door to door and surveilling people and ratting them out, right? Or like subjecting them to particular kinds of political control. But what we are doing is producing a sense of reality, right, for the library of what points of view are valued and which aren't, how materials about the Philippines are cataloged and classified as subject to US control from the very beginning. So this, I think, is like something I'd like to tease apart a little more, and I wish that I was there with you so that you could help me sort of think about this, but the ways that librarian knowledge organization schemes are of a piece with the US sort of wholesale application of its sort of approach to managing people and populations, managing books and other kinds of materials, sort of trying to fit everything into an American system that sort of violently excludes everything that doesn't contribute to the growth of its power, right? And so now that's like a big idea. So I want to go back down to a small idea and think about the ways that these classification systems produce the experience of the library. So here's a floor map of my library, which I'm sitting in right now. And you can see it's like built so that the patron can come in and say, ooh, where can I scan things? Where's the emergency exit? Where can I go to the bathroom? Those questions that everybody has. But you also see the organization of materials, right? That books are going to go A to here, and then F to N, and then P to R. So remember, this is like how I'm going to walk the system. The infrastructure has produced this reality that I'm walking through in the library. So remember, the materials about the annexation of the Philippines are going to be in the east. They're going to be right over here, you know, in this book section. But where are, so that is how the infrastructure sort of produces the space that we're going to walk through and walk in. And if I can, so I'm interested in how librarians in the Philippines have pushed back against this. They've said, you know, and I don't even know if it's pushed back. And this is something I'd love to talk with everyone about, but like, how have librarians in the Philippines sort of had to deal with the fact that the US classification system is the system that was used to set up and structure the library, but because it can't help but fail right? Because it is an American system to represent Filipino reality, the development of the Filipiniana designation allows Filipino librarians to librarians in the Philippines to both use this system for the affordances that it gives, for the ways that it allows the collections in, say, at UP Diliman to be legible to me in my office chair in the United States, because we're using the same classification system. So it allows the sort of for our collections to be in conversation with each other in ways that they wouldn't otherwise be if we didn't share that classification scheme. But because it can't account for a Filipino reality, we have the Filipiniana designation, which enables the library to, have the affordances of the universal classification system, while also acknowledging that there's a whole subset of materials that simply isn't sensical. It doesn't make sense within the information structures that have been exported by the United States. So for me, when I think about a critical librarianship that acknowledged a global context outside of the United States, that acknowledged that the United States is itself a global actor, that due to its sort of hegemonic, the hegemonic role it plays in the world, its legacy as a violent colonial power, its ongoing imperial intervention in parts of the world, sort of all over the planet, in the bloodless way that we share our library and information science structures, right? But also in terms of waging war and conflict, right? That a critical librarianship would have to take something like the Filipiniana designation and think about how that can speak back to the structure of power as it emanates from the US global sort of center. So I think that's a sort of idea that I've been working through over the past couple of years as I've been going back and forth to the Philippines, thinking about the ways that the knowledge organization structure, the infrastructure, and the ways that it produces both ideology, produces and reproduces dominant US ideologies, as well as responses that push back against it, like the Filipiniana collections, and thinking about how to sort of make those points of connection and resistance and construction sites for potential struggle. So I'd like to end with this photo that I took of, this was a sort of big fight about a union struggle at my old institution at Long Island University. And I like it for its reminder that anything that we want to be different in the world will require mass action and all of us getting together and committing and agreeing to fight with each other for the better world that we know is possible. I think the library can be a site of articulating and generating those kinds of struggles with each other. I think we, because we spend all of our time building infrastructures that have to do with the world, like creating a sort of knowledge of and about the world, that working together and struggling together over some of the sort of tenets of critical librarianship. I mean, I just think there's a lot of potential for making a different kind of world with each other. Sort of taking this conflict, this slippage between the US approach to knowledge organization and how the Philippines and other countries have responded and worked against it as a cited departure for a critical librarianship that would acknowledge the horrors that the US has wrought upon the globe. So on that cheerful note, I'll end and hope that we have a little bit of time to talk, if not in this Q&A section, in the next time that I get to visit UP Diliman. Maraming salamat po. Bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Drabinski, for giving us an informative and insightful lecture. As we transition, may I reiterate that for those of you who just tuned in, this is a special episode of the 2020 UP SLIS webinar series offered by the UP School of Library and Information Studies in celebration of its 59th anniversary and the 30th Library and Information Services Month. If you have any questions, just go to menti.com and type the code 438916. Please check the previously posted questions to avoid duplication. While we're waiting for questions, I would like to take this opportunity to announce that the UP SLIS coffee table book is now available for ordering. You may reserve your copy by filling up the form at bit.ly/SLISCTB. That's bit.ly/SLISCTB, all in capital letters. Or you may also send your inquiries at coffeetablebook at slis.upd.edu.ph. That's coffeetablebook at slis.upd.edu.ph. All proceeds from the coffee table book shall go to the construction and renovation of the new UPSLIS building. We would also like to invite LIS researchers and practitioners to submit their papers to the 2020 issue of the Philippine Journal of Librarianship and Information Studies, or the PHJLIS. The PHJLIS publishes articles discussing issues and developments from all fields in the area of library and information science. For more information about the PHJLIS, please visit the phjlis.org or send an email to editor@phjlis.org. Again, that's editor@phjlis.org. And finally, to help our brothers and sisters affected by the typhoons Raleigh and Ulysses, there are a lot of relief and bayanihan efforts by the various UP organizations. We would like to mention the efforts of the UP Library and Information Science Students Association, or the UP LISA, for their donation drive called Pagbubuklod to help those affected by the typhoon in Cagayan. You may check out their Facebook page to know more about their donation drive. Again, that is the UP Library and Information Science Students Association, or the UP LISA. Also, if you're a UP SLIS student listening right now, the SLIS Student Council is conducting a survey to know your thoughts with regard to how you would want to proceed with the rest of the first semester of this academic year. So please participate by answering the survey at bit.ly/SLIS SEM Sensing. That's bit.ly SLIS SEM Sensing. Okay, now we move on to the questions posted by our viewers. And Emily, again, thank you so much for your lecture. While you're delivering your lecture, I've just realized that whenever I visited the UP Diliman Library, it's normal for me to go to the basement for the Filipiniana, and
Uh-huh.
it has never occurred to me that it should have been like just one part of the general collection. But we do have, you're correct, we do have a separate section for the Filipiniana, and that is something that hasn't occurred to me till
Mm-hmm.
now when you've given your lecture.
And
But
there's a rule, right? 10% of the collection has to be Filipiniana, I
yes,
think.
yes, we
Yes.
do have that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And right now, our viewers are really excited about the lecture. We
Oh,
actually
good.
have 8 questions waiting for you. So
Great.
let's start with, I believe, the easier one. Have you ever
Okay.
submitted a correction to the Library of Congress classification?
Really good question. And no, I have not. There
How do
is
you submit one anyway?
there's a process. There's a, what is it called? The SACO, the Subject Access Cataloging something, something. But it's a group at Library of Congress, and you can submit a change request, and it goes through a whole committee review process. I think it's pretty hard to get subject headings changed. Sandy
Mhm.
Berman, and I included that quote from Sandy on the slide. he, in the first version of his book that came out in the 1970s, it had a tear out card section in the back where you could tear it out, put a stamp on it, and put it in the mail, requesting to get headings changed from LC. But it's very hard to do. There are some American librarians working on on changing language around gender and sexuality headings and others, but it's a difficult process. And I'm not a cataloger. I'm a teacher, so I don't really understand as much as I critique. So I haven't done that. It's possible, but very hard.
I see. I see. Well, thank you for giving us some information about that. Another question here is, now this one is very recent, related to the recent events happening in the United States. How do you think the victory of Biden would affect the critical librarianship ideology in the United States?
Yeah, it's a big question.
It
It's
is.
been 2 weeks. I'm not sure if Trump will leave. I think we're in new territory in the United States, and I think I have concerns, and all of us have concerns about the transition to a Biden presidency. I think there's something about Trump and about these sort of far right turns that make sort of ideas that I might have had about inequality and racism in the United States that I might have, like, you might have, in your bones that stuff is real, but then there's something about Trump and his attack on people and the sort of venomous evil that came from his presidency, really, that made it really obvious. So I think Biden, because he's a sort of he's not as sort of coarse as Trump, it doesn't feel as dangerous. There's some threat, I think, that people will imagine things are good now, things are fine now. And I felt that when I was watching Biden's acceptance speech, and he talked a lot about returning to the America that he knows exists underneath Trump. And if you look at the history of the United States, returning to that America is really, that's a really violent America. It's violent globally. It's violent internally towards people of color and African American people. And so as long as Biden is sort of continues to govern like an American, I think we have a lot of work still to do. I don't think if anything, it makes it more important for us to surface and talk really directly about some of the harm we see.
I see. Yeah, we wish for a peaceful transition of power over there in the United States.
Thank you. I just can't tell if I should be afraid or not.
Yeah.
That's how it feels.
Another question here. You mentioned about the dominance and power of the U.S. in many aspects of our world, librarianship included, especially in the Library of Congress classification. How do you feel being a citizen of that dominant and powerful country?
That's a big question, right? I have a few thoughts about it. Well, I have many thoughts about it. One is, I think when when you are in the sort of dominant position, it can be hard to see the harm around you. So as I said in the talk, and for me, going to the Philippines was the first time that I had been outside of America looking back at the US, right? I'd been to Canada, but that's something like, it's just sort of feels like Michigan, it feels like Detroit, it's not, it didn't feel like different enough. But then when I went to the Philippines, I was like, oh, the United States is actually a really dangerous actor in the world. And, the inequality that the United States relies on, the wealth that it extracts from the world is sort of staggering. And so I sit here in the United States and I have my computer and I'm talking to you, and it's like, it's hard to critique the water that you swim in if you're a fish, But what I think for me now, I think the most important conversation that I can have in librarianship is to take critical librarianship, an idea I've worked and written and talked and taught a lot about, but I don't see it having a clear reckoning with its location inside of the United States. And so how I feel from where I sit is that I feel like it's really important to bring the global into the conversation, which is why I was really grateful for this invitation to start doing that. And I'm hoping that in conversations that we can continue having from the US and the sort of relationship that I'm building with you all, that can be a conversation that we talk more about. Yeah.
Yes, and we also thank you for doing that, for making the conversation on critical librarianship. We have another question here. How could you incorporate critical librarianship when dealing with foreign language collections with different arrangement standards? For example, literature and publications in China.
I don't know enough about that to really answer that question, and that's I think says something about my sort of parochial American sensibility. I don't deal with foreign language collections, so I don't have a lot of knowledge about that. But I would be very interested in talking to whoever asked that question about what they think. Right? It would be cool to hear about that.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is right. You can, aside from posting question, you can also post your suggestions and comments with this. And from your lecture, I can feel that you really miss the public interaction with your with your lecture.
Oh, I really do. I just really,
Mm,
dialogue is how we make knowledge together.
yeah.
And that's, I think, for me, at the root of critical librarianship. And so not being able to do that is very painful for me.
It is really very different. We have
Very.
another question here. What suggestions can you give to the librarians in the Philippines that are collecting and classifying indigenous knowledge materials? So this is from different
Mhm.
indigenous communities in the Philippines.
Sure. I mean, like, I don't know how that work is happening where where you are. So when I have been to the library at the University of Philippines, Baguio, right? And that looking at the collections there um, from the Cordilleras, but I don't know. Um, like that's the sort of question where I would want to know what those
What
catalogers and
practices
classifiers are
we do
doing,
have?
right?
Yeah.
And I
How
think
about, yeah, go ahead.
there's like a tension. I want to use the dominant knowledge organization scheme and subject headings that everyone uses so that I can be a part of the sort of way that knowledge moves in those systems. But at the same time, I don't want to lose the specificity. So I guess there's a library in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada that has it's called the Weiwa Library, and they use a classification system designed to capture Indigenous knowledge. And it's a really interesting collection. So I might suggest looking at how they've been doing things. Um, but yeah, I know that's a big conversation.
Um, I would like to follow up on this question. Like, do you have? We also know you also have native peoples in the United States,
Oh yes,
and do you have like a different system for classifying their literatures or something?
not in the libraries I've worked in. So the only one I know is the Brian Deere classification in Canada, which is an Indigenous classification system. But I don't know of any in the United States. I know that there must be some, but it's just out of what I know.
I see. Well, thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to another question here. Should narratives surrounding librarianship, say collection and organization, tell both sides? I remember Kipling
Uh,
pointed out a white man's burden, and it seems it's still around in conferences.
Oh, can
So
you say that question one more? Can you
yes,
say that
so the
again?
question goes like this: should narratives surrounding librarianship, say collection and organization, tell both sides? I
Okay.
remember Kipling pointed out a white man's burden, and it seems it's still around in conferences. So that's like
Hmm.
a remark at the end.
Yeah, see, that's the sort of thing where like I wish I could talk to you, like
Yeah.
the like
Let's see
because I
if they
think
submitted like a clarification for that.
yeah, submit a clarification.
Here's another one. Good day. This is from Lloyd Rodriguez from Bulan Sorsogon. Hello, Lloyd. My question is, what are the resources that you can suggest to other librarians who are far behind in other resources of facilities needed to be a good librarian? Other resources of that facilitates needed to be a good librarian.
So
I'm
what are some other resources that I would suggest
yes.
about critical librarianship?
I'm guessing that they're asking for good resources if they want to be more involved in critical librarianship.
Yes. So I think there are a few publications. There's a journal called the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, JCLIS, that publishes articles about critical librarianship. And then they're all, I think it's quite a popular topic in the United States and these days. So there's a lot of, there are many webinars and things. Uh, and then I have some resources that I'm happy to send to you. I wrote an encyclopedia article, which is a good sort
Mhm.
of like explainer. And then, so that might be a good place to start.
Is that available from your website?
No, no, because I stopped updating my website, but
Oh,
I'll
okay.
download it and send you a copy. Yeah,
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, we saw a lot of your list of publications. There's a
yeah,
lot, and you can view it in Emily's website. She has a
yes.
website,
EmilyDrabinski.com. Yeah.
emilydrabinski.com. So
Yep.
visit her website. Okay, so we have a few more questions here. We
Mhm.
still have more time. What does critical librarianship say about using data by U.S. powers, sometimes only available data, and further probing them for alternative narratives? Again, let me repeat the question.
Mhm.
What does critical librarianship say about using data by US powers and further probing them for alternative narratives?
I think this is just a real silence right now in critical librarianship in the United States. I think there isn't a lot of discussion of how to interrogate US data sources and to think about uh, that question. I think there's a lot of work to be done in the US. But there may be uh, other sorts of literatures engaging with those questions, but I haven't seen a lot. So I think it's a real opening uh, for work that scholars could do and practitioners could do if that's a question that's of interest.
Uh, I'm thinking about the open data portals
Mm,
in the United States. We do have a lot
yes,
of
yes, yes.
those,
Okay,
and if there are people like looking or being critical about those data, like so you're saying
probably.
there's really very limited action in
Well,
terms
I
of
don't
research
know.
about that now.
When you say it, when you clarified it a bit, and it is getting late for me, so I apologize. But I think uh, there is definitely critical data studies, but it doesn't happen inside of librarianship. It's a I think more media studies scholars doing work in that area, which is sort of not what I do, so I don't know much about it.
I
I
see.
think, but there's a lot of global critique of open access movements, right? And I think
Yeah.
that I would imagine those sorts of conversations would apply to data as well.
Yes, and quite very important as well.
Yeah.
We have another question here. Have there ever been any significant changes to the LCC headings in terms of becoming more politically correct? Maybe you can share some
Hmm.
examples that you've seen, some schedules that change throughout.
It's interesting. I don't know any. Oh, no. Yes. Um, Materials about transgender. experience used to be classified in psychology as a kind of psychological problem.
Oh,
So
okay.
as if transgender identity was about some sort of internal sickness, right? That there's something wrong with you that has to be cured. And the classification now places those materials in the HQs primarily, unless it's explicitly about the psychological dimension. So, which recognizes transgender lives as not not a not a psychological problem. So that's one example. Um, there's more work, I think, done on changing the subject headings because that's easier. So if you make a change in the classification, you have to move everything around, and
Yeah.
think about what will happen once the library reopens after COVID and all the books come back all at once. And you have to check them all in and shelve them all. And it's going to be a nightmare, right? It's going to be a big, big project. So anytime you make a change in the classification, it's similarly big, big project. So I think it's very uncommon. It's less common to make classification changes than to make subject heading changes. Which are sometimes about political correctness and sometimes just because language evolves, right? So we used to call
Mhm.
cookbooks cookery. And I don't ever say cookery, but I do say cookbooks, right? And so they changed finally that language. So there's some updating that happens like that.
I see. Well, thank you for that. That's quite a big change of putting the transgender literature from psychological disorders uh,
Mm-hmm.
to the current one, which is in
Mm-hmm.
HQ. So that's quite a big move and a good one too.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Another question here. Let me just read it first. Okay, so this one is asking, do you think LCC moves beyond imposing an American viewpoint to acting as a system of social control?
Mm. I mean, I think it's more impactful than people realize because of the way that it structures space. So the way that it sort of that your book stacks will be arranged in a certain way because of the classification. So it controls sort of your movement through ideas. So that example of having materials related to transgender experience in psychology, and you move it to the HQs where it's around, shelved near books about gay and lesbian identities. Uh, that's that's sort of controlling what you see when you're on the when you're walking on like past a shelf and looking. um that said, I don't know how much time people spend in the stacks anymore, spend looking at books. uh like our circulation numbers are pretty low. It's like people really do a lot of more use a lot more electronic materials than they use books. So I often wonder if it even really matters anymore. Like I have that every time I'm talking about classification. I'm like, is anyone using a book? Like,
Like, is
does it matter?
serendipitous discovery still happening
Right.
in the electronic environment?
Yeah. I mean, do you think people are like going to the book stacks and looking around?
I would say that at least for us here in the Philippines, that is still the
Hmm.
situation. Uh, if unless what I mean to say is that before COVID, that is pretty
Yes.
much the situation, but now, yeah, everything's they're trying to search for it online.
Yeah. I mean, someday we'll go back to the book stacks. I think. So I think it's like there's a little bit of social control happening there, but also what we like how we understand the way the system works. I think that is like social control systems that are beyond the library
Mhm.
operate in similar ways that are harder to see, like classifying and ordering people. Like I think about just like when I've visited the Philippines and I go to the airport, right? And like it sorts people, right? You're from the Philippines, you're a foreign visitor, you're an overseas foreign worker, right? Like it's got the way that people are classified. So I think that act of classification, which is about social control and about order. I started reading a book this week about immigration policy and how workers were classified when they came to the US from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, right? And so the classification of those workers is like it's not the library classification, but I think if you can understand library classification, you can apply that same analysis to systems that are definitely about social control, that are about controlling labor, immigration, sexuality. And so I think there's just really interesting connections that you can make there if you can understand the Library of Congress classification system, which, you know, as librarians, we can do pretty effectively.
Yeah, that's really very pretty interesting. Another question here. Let me just move on. I believe we still have time for a few more questions. With the question of having a universal scheme as well as local knowledge, do you have suggestions for recording the historicity of the terms that extract the changes in terms over time? This is quite interesting.
That's a really good question. I think that's the way to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is to not erase the language, but instead provide a record of how it has changed over time, maybe within the record, but like
Yeah.
most users probably don't care, but like you would want to keep it. And, you know, the authority files for Library of Congress, they show you that. But I think if you could, you know, that's a good way of managing wanting to sort of be a part of the bigger circulation machine that requires we all use the same standard language, with wanting to have particular headings that reflect the way that knowledge functions in a local collection. So having both of those things is ideal. I think it's very hard to do. At least here in the United States, there's not a lot of resources in most libraries put towards the classification and cataloging of materials. Like you get your record from the vendor who sold you the book, or you download it, you copy it from someone else's record in WorldCat, you know, and so the labor of adding local headings and local classification work, it's a question of resources, and our institutions putting resources into those projects. And in my experience, usually not. You know, so it's a thing you really have to fight for if it matters to you in your library, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question here is the Philippines has more than 30 dialects or 30 languages, and Filipino, our national language, is the Tagalog dominant dialect. What
Mhm.
strategy do you suggest to these other dialects and works in these dialects to flourish? That is quite
Right. It's
a difficult question, really.
wow. If I knew the answer, it'd be good to go. But yeah, that's really challenging. I mean, I do think that when we make systems that are hospitable to and have room for other sort of that have room for difference, uh, like you make the slot and then something can fill it in, right? So I think having classification structures or local schemes that make clear in the design of the system that you're expecting literatures produced in these other languages and these other dialects, you know, there's a way that I think that can be productive. But mostly I think being mindful of, and for those of us who come from dominant positions, being mindful that that is like if you are a speaker of a language in the Philippines that's not Tagalog, you probably really, I mean, I don't know enough about the Philippines. Do you really know that? Do you feel that difference? Do you feel it to be like is Tagalog because that's the national language? Is there like language justice movements in the
Yes,
Philippines?
currently the national language is Filipino and English, but if you really look at it,
Okay.
Filipino is just really Tagalog. So
Okay.
so you're right. It kind of ostracize the other languages that are being spoken, especially from people from the southern part of the Philippines. So I guess that's where this question is really coming from. But I'm really interested with what you mentioned earlier. Do you think that if we like create the room or the classification for that language, the literature will come after, or is it the other way around?
Well, I think both are sort of working together, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm thinking about a library and I'm thinking about a collection development person, like someone whose job it is to build the collection, and I have a list of things that I'm looking for in order to build my collection. If that list includes, um,
Like if
like
it
what's
has
a
room for example, for Cebuano, for other languages,
part of my
then
job is to build a Cebuano collection.
I see.
So
Okay,
like that doesn't make the literature happen, but it makes me go find it. And
that's right.
I'm sure that literature is produced in all of these languages, right? And so it's just a matter of deciding that it matters enough to collect them, you know?
Yeah, I see. That's right.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's move on. We only have a few more questions. I believe we have only two more questions. So,
Okay.
what is your challenging experience as? So you mentioned that you right now you're not a cataloger, but the question here is, what is your challenging experience as a cataloger that you've encountered?
Mm. Well, I worked as an indexer for a while when
Mm-hmm.
I was first out of library school. And the challenge was uh, keeping the work interesting enough that for me, I found it not very interesting, not that fun to do, and so I would, I was an area studies cataloger, so in a political science cataloger or an indexer, and you just end up with like maybe 10 terms that you apply to everything because it's just
Mm-hmm.
easier than having to approach each document or each, I was doing indexing journals. So it's very difficult to approach each article as a separate new thing that's worthy of my analysis and engagement and thought and care. And it's like, whatever, I'll just call it, you know, um, I'll just like use the same term that I always use, like foreign relations. Like that was
Mm-hmm.
a heading I used all the time. United States foreign relations, Philippines. And I would just put that on everything that had anything to do with the Philippines. It's like, whatever. It's like, I don't want to think, this is not that fun to do. And so I think that's the challenge, like treating everything with as if it deserves and is like has the right to metadata that is sufficient and fully descriptive. Um, yeah, I think that's the hard part. Yeah.
Keeping it challenging and interesting. Okay, so before we ask our last, actually, I'm sorry, that is actually
That's the last
our
question.
last question. Um, before we
Did we ever
end,
get clarification on the white man's burden question?
yeah, we haven't received any more. So for the person who submitted the Whiteman's burden question, we still have more. We still have a few more minutes. If you want to clarify that question,
I could tell
Emily
one small
would be
story about
happy.
that
Ah,
relevant
yeah,
to
go ahead.
that. So I was at the American Library Association annual meeting, and I was an incoming member of the ALA Council, which is the governing body of ALA. And the executive director of ALA was giving his sort of talk to everyone about the wonders of ALA. And he said, and around the world, everyone admires the librarianship of the United States. And we continue to, sort of share everything that we know with the whole wide world. Right. And I was like, that is really bizarre. Because I don't, it's, it was so foreign to me that we would still live in a time when an American could say without sort of troubling it at all or complicating it at all that we are the best and it is our job to spread what we know all around the world. It was like going back in time or something. And I thought, well, here is a field that is sort of frozen in its perspective on the rest of the world, that it really imagines that it is. And that is not to say that American librarianship doesn't, isn't great. Like there's lots of great stuff, but it's not like it's ours and we share it benevolently with the world. It's like all of us are librarians trying to make sense of knowledge and information and make it circulate and share it. And it's not like the fact that I'm talking to you from Brooklyn means I'm better at doing that. That just means that I'm in Brooklyn. That's all it means. And so I think that sensation that American librarians will save the rest of the world is definitely an energy I have felt at American library conferences. And I don't know if you feel it at conferences in the Philippines when you have visitors from the US.
Well, one thing that I would say is that whenever we have international visitors, we really look up to them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain level that we do look up to them.
Yeah. I mean, I do too, right? When people come from another part of the world to share what they know, it's like, yeah. But it's not because like, yeah, I don't know. Anyway.
There's I believe the same person who submitted that question submitted this one, a
Okay.
clarification. So the person said more of, should narratives surrounding librarianship, say collection and organization, tell both sides,
Hmm.
balance, or should the narrative be more from your side only?
Ooh, yeah. I think being explicit about what side you are is useful. So we do, I think, as librarians have a responsibility to share sort of all sides of an issue and to make room in our collections for a multiplicity or a plurality of voices. But I know my political stance, and I think being clear about that means that you know where I'm coming from and I'm not hiding anything. And so I think like both sides are important, but it's important also to know what our politics are and to share those pretty openly with people that we're working with.
Yeah. This is very interesting because recently a lot of people are talking about the United States media when they started cutting off the the speech of
Hmm.
who
Yeah, I
because
do. Yeah.
whenever he started telling out lies, so it's some sort you really cannot just present voices at the same
Hmm.
time equally.
Yeah, I mean, I think when voices have like are bent on evil and destruction, it's important to cut them off. Yeah, there's no reason to hear that other side. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Emily, thank you very much. We still have some things to announce, but let me just greet our viewers. Thank you very much for watching this webinar with Emily Drabinski. I just would like to greet our viewers from Cebu City and also from, let me just look at the list. Sorry. We also have from Malabon University and RG De Castro colleges in Bulan, Sorsogon. And also we have viewers from Leyte, and also we have viewers from Thailand. Hello. Thank you very much for tuning in. Okay. So again, thank you very much, Emily, for answering our viewers' questions. At this point, I would like to call on our college secretary, Professor Rhea Rowena U. Apolinario, to give the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, PJ. The discussion classifying difference, critical in a global context by Emily indeed confronted us to question the existing hegemonic process in our libraries. Cataloging and classification, for instance, which, according to Emily, and which I agree as well, is inherently biased. The presentation led us to, and I quote, acknowledge and then interrogate the structures that produce us as librarians, our spaces as libraries, our patrons as students, faculty, and the public whose interface with the sum of human knowledge is produced in large part by us. End quote. This is an excerpt from Emily's article last year entitled What is Critical About Critical Librarianship? Emily's talk definitely does not end here. We are called upon to ask, to question, to be critical, and to make a difference. Like what Emily said, anything that requires difference in the world requires mass action. All of us getting together. But there is also what Ferris and Steins in 2008 mentioned about social change. And they said that a profession, or helping professions as they coined it, which include careers in nursing, counseling, teaching, and those in social service, nonprofit, and law enforcement sectors, and others, can contribute to society to make a difference, where every encounter with a person or client is an opportunity heading for social change. I firmly believe that librarianship is included in those professions. Thank you so much, Emily, for your time and for sharing to us your valuable knowledge on critical librarianship. Your presentation not only expanded or broadened the discussion of critical librarianship in the Philippines, but also challenged us to push it further. It is also an opportune time, like what Dean Mary Grace mentioned earlier, that we are celebrating this November the Library and Information Services Month in the Philippines, pursuant to Presidential Proclamation number 837 series of 1991. The 30th LIS Month celebration focuses on engendering public awareness to the invaluable service that libraries and information centers render. This year's LAS month has the theme Lib Real, of which Lib stands for libraries and the acronym REAL or Real for relate, engage, advocate, and lead. Your talk indeed calls us to engage, advocate, and lead. On behalf of the UP School of Library and Information Studies, we thank you, Emily, for making our LIS month celebration and Road to SLIS 60th anniversary truly special. UPS Elias misses you so much too. We are truly looking forward to having you once again in our humble premises and have that great conversation and discussion over a much greater spread of Filipino food. How about Ilocos empanada
I
or
need
balot?
that. I was looking out at how to make an Ilocos empanada at home, and I think it's
That's
easier
great.
for me to come to you.
And to all of you who joined us in this webinar, thank you very much. To the whole UPS Elias faculty, staff, and students, thank you. To the technical team of this webinar, thank you, thank you, thank you. Muli, maraming salamat po at hanggang sa muli nating pagkikita.
Thank you, Professor Apolinario. Please stay with us for the awarding of the certificate. May I also call on our Dean, Professor Mary Grace Golfo Barcelona. We will now award the certificate of appreciation to our speaker. And the certificate reads, the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies presents this certificate of appreciation to Emily Drabinski for delivering a valuable webinar lecture entitled Envisioning Critical Librarianship for the Philippines, Classifying Difference, Critical Librarianship in a Global Context. As part of the 2020 UP School of Library and Information Studies lecture series, in celebration of its 59th anniversary, given this 18th day of November 2020 at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City. Signed, Rhea Rowena Polinario, College Secretary, and Mary Grace P. Golfo Barcelona, Dean.
Hi. Unfortunately, the certificate did not reach me here in Pampanga, so we'll just send it to you, Emily. So just wait for it in the mail.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much. Maraming salamat. Finally.
Thank you so much. Good night,
Yep.
everyone.
Oh,
Right.
good night. Yeah, good night.
Okay. Again, thank you, Emily. To all our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all had a meaningful takeaways from this webinar. Thank you too to our SLAS faculty for making this event possible. Special shout out to Professor Nathan Isip and Professor Mark Santos for handling the tech side of this event, and to Professor Johan Frederick Kabab and Drej Paul Reyes for their work on the graphics and publicity materials. Please don't forget to register using the link to be shown on screen to receive your certificates. If you missed portions of this webinar. You may rewatch it as a Facebook video or check our YouTube channel at UPSLIS for updates on our upcoming activities. Please follow us at our official Facebook page, UPSLIS, or visit our website, slis.upd.edu.ph. That wraps up our November webinar. Please join us on the first Wednesday of December for another installment of our Webinar Wednesday series. Our next feature is called Kain Tayo, Exploring Filipino Culture and Food Representations in Local Children's Picture Books with our children and young adult literature expert, Rochelle Silverio. This is happening on December 2 at 2 p.m. Philippine Standard Time. Once again, this is Paul Jason Perez, your host and moderator, wishing you all the best. See you on our next webinar.